there. You're right. That was the bumper video people.
Spinning wheel of death. Spinning wheel of death, not my fault.
Alright. Okay, that's okay. That's okay. We'll get it figured out. Alright. That's okay, you didn't need to see any of the slides that I put together anyways, no big deal. Good morning, good evening, how you guys doing tonight? Who here is already back to school? Who here is from Ripon and doesn't have to go back to school till this week? Isn't it a beautiful thing? All right, what a wonderful week to be here. Aren't you glad that we're having CSM tonight so that way you guys can refresh and refuel? And for those of you who are going to school this week, we'll pray for you extra hard since you had an extra week off. Isn't it wonderful? All right, so we kind of saw the bumper video. We're doing this series called Inside Out. Do you guys remember what we talked about last week? Inside Out. What did we talk about? Tyler talked to us about one word. All I'm looking for is one word. One word. 3 letters. What? She said it. What was it? Who? Joy. It was about joy. We talked about joy. We talked about that feeling inside of us that bubbles up, knowing Jesus and knowing what He's done for us inside of us that makes us, for lack of a better word, happy. We distinguish the difference between the happy that we get when we get a toy or when we get something new, right? And we said this is something that can be everlasting even in times of trouble, despair, any time that things look bleak in the world. That joy can still be in us. This week, we're going to move on. Before we go there, we said that joy is what points people back to Jesus, right? That joy in us. That's the story about Sonny asking Tyler why he was always happy, right? We can use that joy inside of us to point back to Jesus. And so this week we're going to change courses a little bit, and we're going to talk about inside out in a different way. There may be no other area of our lives where inside out matters more than the groups we are a part of. Okay? When it comes to the groups we're in, there's something about enjoying being on the inside, right? We all like to be on the inside. We want to be a part of the group. And I got to tell you guys, when I grew up, I wasn't on the inside. I was an outsider. I was the misfit. For the longest time, we had moved around a lot. At age 4, we moved to Arizona. And we bounced around to different schools here and there, and I never really connected. And then by the time I was 8, we moved back to California. And I can remember the first time going to school, coming back to California. It was 2nd grade. My grandma took me to school. She drove this giant Bonneville, and she pulled up into the roundabout. And it was kind of funny because if you guys remember the old school cars, you know, how big they were. You know, you could like throw a football from one side to the other. Those things, they were that big. So I sat in the back corner, and Grandma was up in the driver's seat. And when she got out, because I wasn't leaving, she's like, "Go," and I'm like, "No." She's like, "Go now." I said, "No." So I sat in the back seat for a while, and then she got out, and as she's coming around, guess where I went? Somebody's had an experience with that in a child or two, right? So I jumped to the front seat, and this thing is so big, she couldn't just reach in and grab me. So I'm in the front driver's seat, she's in the back passenger seat, and I'm laughing at her like, "What are you going to do now?" So she comes back around to the driver's side. Guess where I went? This went on about 10 minutes. Finally, I got tired, she got tired. The principal came out, and needless to say, I went to school, but I wasn't happy about it. You see, it was hard for me to make friends. One thing you guys won't really understand because you see me as an extrovert is I am very introverted. But I have become introverted. When I was little, it was very difficult for me to make friends. And so I was always on the outside. It was just hard for me to connect with other people. But it got better. I went to junior high. We finally started settling down. We were finally at a place where my parents decided we're going to stick in this area for a while. And we moved a couple times, but I was fortunate enough to go to the same schools. It was in the same district. But you guys remember junior high, right? You remember junior high? Some of you, it wasn't that long ago. And you really didn't know who your friends were because there was so much going on in junior high, and we're thinking about we have to be the right person, to say the right thing, and do the right thing, and wear the right thing, and it was just a really confusing time for me. I can remember the guy that I thought was my best friend. I don't know if it was here at junior high, I mentioned that I was only ever in one fight, and it was with him at school. The guy was supposed to be my best friend. That didn't last long. But we move on to high school. Freshman year, I met some really great people, and I really started to connect. And they were great, they were loving, and you know what? They reached out to me, and I really started to connect and feel a part of that group. Guess what? At the end of the year, that school closed down. Okay? I was in a district that had 8 schools, and 2 of them shut down. Fortunately, mine was one of them, right? Great. So, we had to go to our rival school, but it was cool. All of my friends, this whole group actually went to that school with me. So I'm thinking that's pretty cool. At least I still have that connection. I won't have to try to learn new people, try to find new friends. They were all going to be there with me. Who has 2 lunches here? What schools have 2 lunches? Yeah, guess what? This isn't just a joke for the school for the message. I was the only one of my group of friends to have second lunch. Oh, God, what are you doing to me? So, second lunch. I'm thinking to myself, who am I going to hang out with? What am I going to do now? I looked around. I don't want to be part of that group. That's the nerds. I don't want to be part of that group. That's the stoners. I don't want to be a part of that group, So guess what? I thought, I'll just wait till after school and hang out with my friends. So I sat under a tree. And eventually a couple guys migrated over to me and sat with me, hung out with me. We ate together every day that whole year. Never got to know them. I don't really remember any of the classes they were in. I didn't do anything with them before school. I didn't do anything with them after school. I can't even tell you their names today. I might, if I looked into a yearbook, be able to pick one of them out, but I don't remember the other one. I just remember they kind of hung out. And so, even though I knew what it was like to be on the outside, to be not a part of a group, I never really invited them to be a part of my group. I never thought about trying to be a part of their group. I just kind of stayed myself and waited until the end of the day so I could hang out with my friends, my group. What kind of friend was I? At that time, I wasn't a Christian. I didn't know Jesus. But I wonder if I did know Jesus at that time, would things have been any different? Would I have tried to open my group to these guys? If you guys were in my position, or if you are in my position, would things be different for you? Hold on to that thought for a second. Today we're going to talk about a story that many of you guys know. A lot of people know this story even outside of the church, or at least they've heard the concept. Who here has heard of the story of the Good Samaritan? It's about everybody, right? Good Samaritan. There's even laws on the books, the Good Samaritan Act, that says if you're doing the right thing with the right motivation, you can't be held liable if you make a mistake. Good Samaritan Act, right? Well, it comes from a story that Jesus shares in the book written by the Apostle Luke. And I'm going to share it with you guys. It's written in chapter 10, starting in verse 25. And behold, the lawyer stood up to put him to the test, that is Jesus, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength, and all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But he, the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him for dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that same road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side." But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Jesus asked the guy, "Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" The lawyer replied, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said, "You go and do likewise." God, we thank you so much for this amazing story. I pray that as we dig into this, you make the words real to us, that you make them so real to us that we want it to go from the inside of us, from the inside of our heart, to the outside of our lives so we can share it with others. Be in our conversations tonight as we dig into this. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so digging into this passage, the first thing we see, we're introduced to a man. We know nothing of him other than he is a lawyer. In our society, what do lawyers study? Law, right? What kind of law? They study civil law, business law, criminal law. There's a bunch of different kind of laws that they can study. But in their society, a lawyer was actually somebody who knew the Old Testament, the Hebrew law, pretty much word for word, verbatim. He knew it back and forth. He knew all the Old Testament and all the old laws written by the Hebrews on how to live a godly life. He was an expert. He knew exactly what was needed in the Old Testament to be right with God. He knew it. But he still stands up and he's putting Jesus to the test here. He asks Jesus something that he knows the answer to, but he asks him anyways. He asks Jesus, "How do I get to heaven?" Jesus throws it back at him, right? He knows the answer. The lawyer knows the answer. The way to heaven was to keep the law of God and keep it perfectly. To keep it perfectly. Jesus plays a game with this guy, and he asks him, "Well, tell me what the law says." And he replies, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. And your neighbor as yourself." The lawyer knew this. He knew that all the Old Testament was wrapped up into these 2 pieces of truth. When you break it down, it's love God above anything and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what it is, guys. That's what he knew it. He wrapped it up in this nice, neat little package and told Jesus, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty self-explanatory. But this guy isn't done there, right? He starts to think about it. He starts to do this little self-assessment. And I could just imagine, he's a lawyer. He's thinking, all these laws, as they're going through his head, I got that one, I got that one, I got that one. Yeah, I'm good at this, I can do this. But then he started thinking, well, maybe I might have broken the law, but it just depends on how we word certain things, right? Maybe he's trying to bend things. As he's standing there, he appears to be pretty confident about one of those pieces of truth. He starts to think, I got this God thing down. Do you think that was legit? Do you think that was true? Do you think he got the loving God thing down? He thought so, right? He thought that loving God was that bit of truth that he had. It's okay. So I don't need to worry about that one. But he starts to think about the neighbor thing. And he kind of starts to question, well, maybe I don't have this neighbor thing down. So he asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And when you ask Jesus questions, you may not like the answer, right? Who is my neighbor? So Jesus tells the man a parable. He uses a parable to explain to him what's going on here. And I know you guys just started school. I didn't say parabola, not math, Liam. Not parabola, parable, right? Got that? Okay. Anyone? No? Okay. So, parable. So I read about parables, and you got to understand something. Parables are salvation stories. Okay? Parables are a moral lesson with a spiritual lesson spiritual meaning inside of it. I read it explained like this. The parable was like a doorway. Jesus' listeners stood at the doorway and heard of him. If they were not interested, they would stay on the outside. They'd probably just get the moral lesson. But if they were interested, they would walk through the doorway and think about the truth behind the parable and what it meant to their lives. The spiritual meaning, they would get it. Or if they didn't get it, they would ask about it. And so here it is, guys. If you don't understand the key to the parable, you won't understand the spiritual meaning at all. Remember this. There's going to be a quiz leader. Okay? Remember this. So Jesus tells this man a parable. Jesus tells him that there's this guy who was walking down the road. He's walking down a road that everybody knew. It was a steep road, and it was probably pretty rugged on one side, pretty steep. Who remembers the road to Hume? Steep on one side? A little bit crazy? Really fun to drive in a bus? No? Maybe not? Okay, so really steep on one side. You're getting the idea. But this wasn't as improved as that. You know, there wasn't the whole asphalt thing. It wasn't wide enough for two buses to pass. Even though I don't think you guys would like to pass a bus on that road. But there's a cliff on one side. And there's a bunch of these switchbacks. Have you guys been hiking? And when you get to the point where you get to the trail and it does that sudden switchback, and you see at the end of that switchback, there's usually like these caves, or there's rocks, or there's these bushes, and it's just like this really creepy place that you wouldn't want to be. And well, that's kind of what I imagine in this area. Because this area was known for people getting robbed. It wasn't something that Jesus just pulled out of the hat. He used a real life area, real life idea that these people would understand and they would know. So there was this man. He walked down this road, and he was a Jew. He was Jewish, and really you're like, well, is that important? It might be important later, and we'll get to that. He's a Jewish man. He's walking down this road, and then he gets jumped. He gets beaten within an inch of his life. He gets, his possessions are taken, and he's left for dead. And as he lays there bleeding, gasping for air, we're introduced to three people. And Jesus goes for the big guns first. He tells them the first person that comes by is a priest. And most people would think, hey, the priest is probably going to stop and do something, right? Hey, that's the guy who is following God actively. He's in the temple. He knows all the rules. He knows the Old Testament. He knows the good that he ought to do. And he's the one who should be modeling that behavior. What does Jesus say he does? Walks around the guy like he didn't even see him. All right, so there's 100 possibilities, 100 possible reasons that maybe he did that. Maybe he thought the guy was dead. And priests weren't to be around anything that was dead. So, the next guy's a Levite. And Levites were assistants in the temple. So maybe the priest is thinking, I know the Levite's behind me, and maybe he'll take care of it for me. So maybe there's a good reason that the priest goes by. The priest knew the Levite knew just as the priest did all the things that the Old Testament said. And he knew that he was obligated to do works of mercy as well. But what did he do? He walked around too. So the third guy we get introduced to, the crowd about this time is probably assuming Jesus is going to say that just a normal, everyday Jewish guy is going to walk up and help this guy, right? But they had no idea what was coming. Jesus blows everybody's mind when he says that the next person that comes up is a Samaritan. Okay? Samaritans and Jews hate each other. Like Hatfield and McCoy hate each other. They have feuded for a long time. By the time Jesus is on earth, they were battling, wars, fights. There is no love between these two people groups. So when Jesus says a Samaritan came up, the crowd's probably thinking he's saying, hey, this guy came up and he started kicking him or stabbed him or threw him off the cliff, right? But no. Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus tells him, what? what did this Samaritan do? Jesus said the Samaritan had compassion. Not only did he tend to these man's wounds, but he picked him up and put him on his donkey, which means that he had to walk while he took him to an inn where he could get more help. And then he paid for the hotel and the help. A day's wages. He went out of his way. Jesus wraps up the parable with a question to the lawyer. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? The lawyer answers, the one who showed mercy. He couldn't even say the word Samaritan. He just said the guy who showed mercy, and he walked away. I told you earlier there was going to be a pop quiz, right? The key to understanding the parable, if you don't understand the key to it, you will never understand the spiritual meaning. Who is the key character in this story? Guesses? Riley? The one who showed mercy? You would think, right? Any other guesses? Jesus is always the key, right? Who we got? The Samaritan? Okay, guys. So I didn't say the parable. I asked who's the key character in the story. Ava. The lawyer. That's exactly right. The lawyer. You see, the lawyer was self-righteous to say the least. Right? He thought he had it all. He thought he knew it. He thought he had all the rules down. But he didn't. The truth of the matter is the law existed to show that it was impossible to follow it perfectly. And on our own, we cannot attain that closeness with God. The point of the parable was to crush the man's spirit, to crush his self-righteousness. Because he was only trying to follow the rules. Because he was trying to do the things that the law was telling him you couldn't do. You see, until we ask Jesus into our hearts and learn to love God with all we are and love our neighbors as ourselves, not just specific groups of people, we're going to miss the mark and be separated from God for eternity. Jesus shows us what it truly looks like. It's showing a compassion for even those people who aren't in our groups. For those people who are in groups that we think the least about. It means going the extra mile for someone who we think is our enemy. It's only when we view this parable through that lens, when we stop and look at ourselves as we are, broken, self-righteous, selfish people who need Jesus, can we really begin to dissect the parable and determine how the story can apply to our lives. You see, Jesus is looking for an inside-out change. Are we living like the priest and the Levite, walking through life with excuses as to why we aren't stepping outside of our groups? It's too dangerous. It could be a decoy for an ambush. I got to get home to my family or my friends or my group. Someone really should help that man, just not me, somebody else. I don't know first aid. It's a hopeless case. He's already gone. I'm only one person. The job is just way too big for me. How about this one? I can pray for him. He brought it on himself. He should have never gone there alone. He never asked me for help. All of these are simply excuses. Are we going an extra mile to be a good neighbor? Are we sitting at lunch with people around us that we may not know, not care about, because they don't fit into our group? Are we being filled with the love of Jesus to the point that we get rid of those excuses and love on those people. Jesus tells us that inside-out change he is talking about will make us want to get to know those people. It will make us want to go that extra mile for them and to invite them to be a part of our group. Having neighbors is one thing, but loving them will always require us to take that one extra step. To act, move, take what we know to be true on the inside and begin to live it out on the outside. Now imagine if this group in this room decided to do the same thing. Imagine that at your school, or your family, or even here, we began to assign value to everyone we met. And we did that one more thing to help them, to make them feel a part of the group, to make them feel loved like Jesus loved them. I think it could change their world. And I really think it could change your world. That's exactly what Jesus wants of us, that inside-out change. So tonight, in our groups and our tables, we're going to talk through these questions. What does it look like to be a good neighbor? Are we being good neighbors to new people who walk in the doors of this group? How can we be good neighbors to people who are walking into this group? Are we being good neighbors at school? How can we be good neighbors at school? Are we being good neighbors at home? And how can we be good neighbors at home? God, we thank you so much for this amazing story. A challenge to each and every one of us to get outside of our comfort zones, to reach out to those who don't know you, that feel lost, that don't have what we have, the love of you inside of us. I pray that you make that inside of us come out and shine in this world. Be in our hearts and our minds as we speak to one another. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.